Ladies and gentlemen, it's a great honour to be invited to address you this afternoon, and thank you very much indeed, Anne, for those kind words. It's rather magnificent speaking to such an enormous audience as well. I once gave a speech at the Sevenoaks Literary Festival in Kent, in England, where fewer people turned up than there were oaks. I'd like to take you back to the evening of Friday the 10th of May 1940, the day on which Winston Churchill became Prime Minister. And in the morning of that day, of course, Adolf Hitler had unleashed blitzkrieg on the West, invading Holland and Belgium and Luxembourg, shortly afterwards, of course, also to invade France. And that had happened at dawn. Churchill met the King at Buckingham Palace and was asked to be Prime Minister. And Churchill later said of that meeting, "I felt as if I were walking with destiny, and that all my past life had been but a preparation for this hour and for this trial." And what I've tried to do in my book is to unpack that statement, to investigate it, to look into the extent that Churchill genuinely was, when he was First Lord of the Admiralty, twice in both the First World War and the Second World War, and Home Secretary and Chancellor of the Exchequer, really being prepared for his hour and his trial of May 1940. But what I also try to do is to look at the beginning part of that sentence, the bit about walking with destiny, because it strikes me as essential to understanding Winston Churchill, to appreciate that he had this driving sense of personal destiny, and that's why I subtitled my book, Walking with Destiny. It's not, as one of my friends told me, because all Americans are interested in destiny and all Englishmen are interested in walking. One of the things that drove Churchill's sense of personal destiny was the enormous number of close brushes with death he had. And it's important to understand, I think, when he was at school, at the age of 16, when he was a schoolboy at Harrow School. Churchill was almost entirely self-educated because he had to be, because he went to Harrow. When he was a 16-year-old schoolboy, he told his best friend, "There shall be terrible upheavals and great struggles in our lives, and I shall be called upon, when Britain is in danger of invasion, I shall be called upon to save London and save England." He said this when he was 16 years old. And everything that happened up to that moment and was later to happen underlined this extraordinary sense of personal destiny. As I say, especially the enormous number of close brushes with death. He was born 2 months prematurely, which, of course, in Victorian England was in itself a close brush with death. When he was 10 years old, he was stabbed in the stomach by a school friend. Clearly not a very close friend. At the age of 11, he very nearly died of pneumonia. And then on that occasion, the doctors administered brandy to the 11-year-old. Both orally and rectally, which you might have thought would have put you off brandy for life, but certainly didn't in Winston Churchill's case. He nearly died in a drowning accident on Lake Geneva, very nearly also in a house fire. He was involved in 2 plane crashes, 3 car crashes. On the front of my book, you can see, well, you probably can't because you're so far away, but nonetheless, when you buy the book, you'll be able to see a huge, vivid red scar down the center of his forehead that came and which used to glow during cabinet meetings when he got angry. And that came as a result of his crossing the road on 5th Avenue and 76th Street in New York. But being an Englishman, he looked in the wrong direction and was hit by a car and very nearly killed. And those, ladies and gentlemen, are only the wartime close brushes with death. In wartime, he fought in 5 wars on 4 continents. He took part. Actually, he came up with a marvelous line in one of his books. He said that there is nothing more exhilarating in life than to be shot at without result. And he spent a lot of time in those wars being shot at without result. He took part in the last great cavalry charge of the British Empire at the Battle of Omdurman, where some 25% of his units were killed or wounded. And then the following year, when his armoured train was ambushed, 34% of his unit were killed or wounded. He then, 2 months later, escaped from a prisoner of war camp in South Africa. And on that occasion, he crossed 300 miles of enemy territory. And he had to hide down a mine shaft. And when the candle he'd brought with him gutted out, he could feel rats scurrying over his face. And then in the First World War, he was as tremendously physically brave as ever. He went over into no man's land no fewer than 30 times as a battalion commander of the 6th Battalion of the Royal Scots Fusiliers. He didn't need to. He could have stayed back at battalion headquarters. There are plenty of colonels who did. But he didn't believe that it was right for him to ask his men to do anything that he wasn't physically prepared to do himself. And on one occasion, only 5 minutes after he'd left his dugout on the front line, a German whiz-bang, high-explosive shell, came and hit the dugout and decapitated everyone inside. And he said on that occasion that he felt as if he could hear the invisible wings beating above him. Churchill wasn't a conventional Christian. In the 5.2 million words that he wrote and the 6.1 million words that he spoke, he never once said the word Jesus Christ at all. However, he did believe in an Almighty. Although theologically, when you look into it carefully, the sole role of the Almighty seems to have been to take care of Winston Churchill. But what this sense of destiny did for him was to give him a complete calmness in the greatest crises, the most perilous moments that my country has ever endured in 1940 and 1941. He was able to joke to his entourage and stay perfectly calm. And he used to make jokes in the House of Commons. There was a confidence motion in 1942. In the old days, we didn't used to have very many confidence motions. They seem to happen every minute nowadays. But back in 1942, his whole government was theoretically at risk. And he made a joke when he said that he was being attacked for the completely useless A-22 tank. And he said that when the teething troubles and the defects of the A-22 tank had become apparent to all, it was appropriately rechristened the Churchill. The key word in that gag is, of course, appropriately. Because Churchill understood, Churchill knew that he had many, many defects and teething troubles in his career. He had got so many things wrong. He'd made blunder after blunder. He had got women's suffrage wrong. He had got the abdication crisis wrong, the gold standard, the black and tans in Ireland. Primarily, he had got the Gallipoli campaign wrong. It was a brilliant idea. The concept was to try to get the Royal Navy from the Eastern Mediterranean through the straits of the Dardanelles that separate Europe from Asia, and get it anchor it off the capital of the Ottoman Empire, Constantinople, modern-day Istanbul, and through the threat of shelling, take Turkey out of the First World War. Had it come off, it would have been one of the greatest strategic coups of the history of warfare. But it didn't. It was a lamentable disaster. Not Churchill's fault when the Navy tried to get through the Straits on the 18th of March 1915. We lost no fewer than 6 ships. And then he doubled down on the defeat, which certainly was his fault, by a massive amphibious assault, at that time the largest amphibious assault in the history of mankind, when we landed on the Gallipoli Peninsula on the westward side of the Straits. And when you see the battlefields, when you go to the battlefields there, you can see 45-degree angles at which the men had to charge up in front of perfectly ready and prepared Turkish machine gun fire. And in the course of the next 8 months, the Allies lost no fewer than 147,000 killed and wounded. And this was held against Churchill personally, even though at the beginning, of course, everybody else was in favour of it at the War Council. But he was held as the ultimate scapegoat. And even in the 1930s, people shouted at him, "What about the Dardanelles?" when they came to his public meetings. But the great thing about Winston Churchill is that he was capable of learning from his mistakes. He was somebody who learnt from all of them, indeed. And in the Second World War, he never once overruled the chiefs of staff in the entire time that he was Prime Minister. He had extraordinary sense, therefore, as I hope I've shown, of personal destiny. One of the reasons that one of the things I'm constantly asked about writing this book is why on earth I should have done it, considering there are 1,009 biographies of Winston Churchill. I know. And the answer is that in the last 6 to 8 years, there has been an absolute avalanche of new sources that have been made available to historians. Her Majesty the Queen allowed me to be the first Churchill biographer to use her father's diaries. And King George VI met Winston Churchill on every Tuesday of the Second World War. They had lunch together at Buckingham Palace. They had to serve themselves from the sideboard because nobody else could be present, because Churchill trusted the king with all of the great secrets of the Second World War. He told him about the nuclear secret, about the ultra-decrypts, about which admirals and generals and ministers were going to be hired and fired, which countries were going to be invaded, when and under what circumstances. And the king wrote everything down. There was nothing that was natural that these two men were necessarily going to get on. They did get on immediately. By the time of the Battle of Britain and the Blitz, the king was referring to Churchill as his friend. And he was the only one of the king's 4 prime ministers who he called by his Christian name. But there was no reason why they necessarily should have got on, because the king had been a staunch supporter of Neville Chamberlain and the policy of appeasement. And of course, Churchill had been a staunch supporter of the king's elder brother, King Edward VIII, during the abdication crisis. But they did get on. And we now know, thanks to the King's diary, everything that was going through, the most important things at least, that were going through Churchill's mind every Tuesday of the Second World War. On top of that, there have been 41 sets of papers that have been deposited at Churchill College Archives in Cambridge since the last major biography of him, including the diaries, the wartime diaries of Mary Soames, Winston Churchill's daughter. I myself discovered the verbatim accounts of the War Cabinet. So we now know I did this 6 years ago, and we now know everything that was said by everybody in the War Cabinet. The diaries of Ivan Maisky, the Soviet ambassador between 1932 and 1943, have now been made available over the last 5 years in Moscow. And he saw a lot of Churchill, of course, especially during the period of the Nazi-Soviet pact. I was very fortunate that the Churchill family allowed me exclusive access to the love letters of Pamela Harriman, who led a very active romantic life during the Second World War, as well as, of course, being married to Randolph Churchill and having a baby by him. She famously had an affair with the founder of Sun Valley, Averell Harriman, who she subsequently married. And also Ed Murrow, the famous American journalist. and Jock Whitney. And General Kenneth Anderson. And Marshal of the Air Force Sir Charles Portal. And someone we just know of as Jerry. Anyway, although I had exclusive access to her papers, clearly nobody had exclusive access to her. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. And what we learn from all these extraordinary new sources is that Churchill was not the buttoned-up Victorian aristocrat of his age and class and background. He was somebody who was able, as Anne mentioned, to burst into tears on no fewer than 50 occasions. He was a man driven by his passions, driven by his emotions. And he would cry under pretty much any circumstance. And this was, it must have been very off-putting to have a British Prime Minister burst into tears, although admittedly that happened last month. But otherwise it's extremely rare. And yet people understood that Churchill was a throwback to an earlier era. He was not, as I say, this stiff upper-class figure. He was actually a throwback to the Regency period, to a period he particularly loved in the 18th century, where aristocrats were able to wear their hearts on their sleeves. He had an incredibly privileged background on one side, in one sense, in that, of course, he was born in a palace, the grandson of a duke, and not just any old palace, Blenheim Palace, a palace that the royals envy. At the same time, though, he had a father, Lord Randolph Churchill, the Chancellor of the Exchequer, who was brilliant, aloof, but disdainful, and never appreciated Winston Churchill in any way. He was harsh. He wrote letters that no father should ever write to any son, letters full of contempt. And yet Churchill did not allow that to affect him. And when his father died at the age of 45 in 1895, when Churchill was 20, he wrote his father's 2-volume biography. He sought out his father's friends. He quoted his father's speeches. He called his own son Randolph. He adopted his father's political views, the Tory democracy of Benjamin Disraeli. And then in 1947, he had a very strange metaphysical experience where he believed that he met his father's ghost. And he spoke to him for a long time, and at no point did he let on that he had been instrumental in helping win the Second World War. And you can see his relationship with his father as being a driving force in his life, something that he was always attempting to impress the shade of his long-dead father. His relationship with his mother also was rocky. She took no notice of him. She was a great Edwardian beauty, half American, of course, but very un-American as a mother, in that she took no notice of him. And in the first 6 months of 1884, when he was 9 years old, she only saw him for 6.5 hours. And yet again, he didn't allow it to affect him. He worshipped his mother and continued to. And when he wrote his great book, his great autobiography, My Early Life, which I really recommend to you, the minute you finish mine, he wrote of her in that book, "She shone for me like the evening star, brilliant but at a distance." He was always broke all his life because they were terrible spendthrifts. And so, as a result, and he was also a magnificent spender. During the 1930s, when his house nearly had to be sold, Chartwell in Kent, nearly had to be sold on 2 occasions, he wrote to his wife his wife Clementine, saying, "No more champagne, we mustn't give guests champagne." And I asked Mary Soames how long that lasted for, and she said 3 days. He completely refused to sack any of his 14 staff, which was one of the reasons he got into financial difficulties. And the first time that he ever made any money, ever got out of the black, and out of the red and into the black, was when he was 73 years old. And he signed the contract for his great Second World War books. And on that occasion, when he did come into money, he did a classically 18th century Regency aristocratic thing to do, which was to buy the first of 37 racehorses. He was not an alcoholic. Many people just assume that he was a alcoholic. This isn't true. He did drink an enormous amount. There's no doubt about that. But he had an iron constitution for alcohol. It was his servant and never his master, as he put it. Actually, as he also put it, I've taken more out of alcohol than alcohol's taken out of me. And one of his friends, C.P. Scott, was to write that Winston Churchill couldn't have been an alcoholic because no alcoholic could have drunk that much. And there's also another wonderful occasion when, after his resignation in 1955, he used to invite pretty much anyone to come and visit him at Chartwell. And he would show them his drawing room, and show them his library and his study. And when they got to the drawing room at 6 o'clock, he would invite them for a drink. And on one occasion, he did this with two Mormons, one of whom said to him, "Strong drink rageth and stingeth like a serpent." And Churchill replied, "I've long been looking for a drink like that." Neither was he a depressive. This is something that I very much have worked out in the 30 years that I've been writing books about Winston Churchill, 5 books with him in the title or the subtitle. It's clear to me that depression, which is a debilitating illness, Churchill didn't suffer from that, or manic depression, what's called black dog. He only uses, let alone bipolar disorder, which I've also seen in some biographies. Churchill only used the phrase black dog once in all of the time that he was, his whole life. And that was in July 1911 when he wrote to his wife Clementine. And at that time, the phrase was used to explain, by Edwardian matrons, to explain the bad temper of children. He was somebody who was able to chair no fewer than 900 meetings of the Defense Committee of the War Cabinet during the Second World War. I do not believe that he had a chemical imbalance form of depression. He did get depressed, undoubtedly. Of course he did. He got depressed at the time of the fall of Singapore in February 1942, the fall of Tobruk in June 1942. He was depressed for much of the Gallipoli campaign. But those are moments, ladies and gentlemen, when any sentient decision-maker would have got depressed. Similarly, with regard to the Second World War, in the 2,194 days of the Second World War, he only got drunk once. It was on the 7th of March, 1944, and what they did on that occasion was to decide, the meeting had gone on till 3 o'clock in the morning. He'd been drinking whiskey, very weak whiskey, but nonetheless ever since 6 p.m. And what they decided on that occasion was to hold the same meeting the next morning as though the last one hadn't happened. And actually, talking about how broke he was all his life, there's a marvelous moment. What he used to do, the way he dealt with this, with being broke, was to write books. He wrote 37 books and 840 articles. And if an editor turned down an article by him, he would just put it in his drawer and wait until another editor came along and tried it out on them. And so there's a marvelous moment in the Second World War, in March 1942, A terrible time, by the way, of course, for the world in March 1942. The Japanese had taken 1/8 of the planet. The British were on the retreat across the North African littoral in front of Rommel. The Russians were on the retreat through Ukraine, and this was the moment that the Prime Minister, and of course any editor would publish anything that the Prime Minister wrote, brought out an old article that he wrote, and so in the Illustrated Sunday Herald for the 7th of March 1942 was published an article by Winston Churchill, the British Prime Minister, entitled, "Are There Men on the Moon?" Concluding that there probably were men on the moon, and certainly such things as UFOs and aliens. Again, were Theresa May to publish an article along those lines, it would be slightly off-putting, but it wasn't with Churchill, owing to the fact that he was seen as a profoundly eccentric man. So how was it that this man was able to be not only the first major British politician to warn against Hitler and the Nazis, but for many years the only major politician who was able to do this? And it strikes me it came from three things. The first was that he was a Philo-Semite. He liked Jews. All his life he'd liked Jews. He'd gone on holiday with Jews. His father had liked Jews. He'd grown up with them, and he believed their contribution to Western civilization was second to none. He was a supporter of the Balfour Declaration. And so that gave him an early warning system when it came to Hitler and the Nazis that was not vouchsafed to many of the other people on the parliamentary benches at that time, many of whom were anti-Semitic. The second thing was that he was an historian. And one of the reasons that I'm proud to be an historian is that Winston Churchill was one, and he was able to place the threat posed by Hitler and the Nazis in the long panoply of threats to hegemonistic threats to the balance of power in Europe, from Philip II of Spain and the Spanish Armada to Louis XIV of France and the War of Spanish Succession, which of course his own great ancestor, John Churchill, 1st Duke of Marlborough, was absolutely epicentral in defeating him. Then Napoleon, and then the Kaiser against whom he himself had fought, and then Hitler. He was able to see that in the continuum of British history. And the third thing was that he was somebody who had come up close and personal to fanaticism in his life, fighting in the northwest frontier of India and in the Sudan, and he therefore understood fanaticism in a way that the other prime ministers of the 1930s, men like Ramsay MacDonald and Stanley Baldwin and Neville Chamberlain, simply didn't. And so he was able, therefore, to see this early on. And it wasn't just foresight before the Second World War. He had already seen the threat posed by Prussian militarism before the First World War, and after the Second World War, at his great speech in Fulton, Missouri, on the 5th of March 1946, the Iron Curtain speech, he was also able to be the first major Western figure to warn against Soviet imperialism in Eastern Europe and Stalin. And so you have these three greatest threats of the 20th century, with Churchill being the first person in each of them. The second thing that I think is very important is that he had, as well as this foresight, he had extraordinary moral courage which equaled his physical courage. He was shouted down in the House of Commons in the 1930s. He was lambasted in the press and ridiculed. He was, on one occasion, the Conservatives nearly took away his seat after the Munich Agreement. But he would not change a word of his warnings about what to do about Hitler and the Nazis. Tremendous moral courage. He always wrote his own speeches, all of his own speeches. Nobody else helped him compose his speeches. He never took any notice of focus groups or opinion polls. There was a marvellous moment when in the House of Commons in the Second World War he was told that it was important that politicians should keep their ears to the ground. And Churchill replied that he didn't think that people would respect politicians caught in so ungainly a posture. So you have this incredible moral courage as well. But what he needed also, on top of all of that, and on top of being able to learn from his mistakes, was eloquence. Because he needed to try to make people listen to him, even though they would not necessarily agree. Indeed, for many years in the 1930s, they completely disagreed with what he had to say. But he used his eloquence in order to achieve that. He worked incredibly hard on his speeches, and he created, therefore, phrases that will live for as long as our English tongue survives. And he was once asked by his private secretary, Jock Colville, what were the three things that, what were the tricks of the trade, what were the techniques that he used in order to make these great morale-boosting speeches in 1940 and 41? And he said, really, there were three things. The first was, don't use overlong sentences. He certainly wouldn't have done very well under the robo thing that Mr. Eggers was mentioning earlier. That would have been a disaster for him, robo grading. Keep the sentences short. Don't use unnecessary subclauses. The second thing was, keep your words short. Don't use long words in order to show off. Instead, use the correct word that you need in each sentence, because each sentence must convey one thought and one thought only. The next thing, he said, was to try to, whenever possible, use words that have been in the common parlance of the English-speaking peoples for 1,000 years. Use Anglo-Saxon words, use Old English words. And when you look at the 141 words of the last paragraph, the peroration of his great "We Shall Fight on the Beaches" speech of the 4th of June 1940, the speech in which he's telling the British people what they're going to do when the Germans land, that they're going to fight on the beaches and in the landing grounds and in the hills and the streets. Fight with ever-growing confidence in the air, ending with that sublime sentence, "We shall never surrender." When you look at that last paragraph, those 141 words, all but two of them come from Old English. The only two exceptions being the word confidence, which comes from the Latin, and surrender, which comes from the French. You did ask an Englishman here, ladies and gentlemen. So to conclude, you have therefore a figure who has this moral courage and physical courage, the ability to learn from his mistakes, extraordinary eloquence, and amazing foresight. And his physical courage, by the way, continues right the way on through the Second World War, of course. He travelled 110,000 miles as Prime Minister outside the United Kingdom during the Second World War. In many ways, he was the glue who kept the big three together. Franklin Roosevelt, of course, was profoundly disabled. He still managed to leave the American continent several times. Stalin was scared of flying and only left the USSR once in the whole of the Second World War. So it was Churchill taking these incredibly long journeys. He often did them through U-boat-infested Atlantic Ocean. He flew in skies where within the radius of the Luftwaffe, in unpressurized cabin, in his early 70s. He also went up onto the Air Ministry roof during the Blitz. He was always wanted to be where the action was. And so you have this extraordinary man who was ultimately, therefore, when you look at all these things, and under no circumstances must you ever underestimate the mistakes and the blunders and the foolish things he did in his life. Nonetheless, when you put together all his qualities, you can see how he was able to go one stage further than even he had predicted for himself as a 16-year-old schoolboy. Because he wasn't just able to save London and England, he saved civilization itself. Thank you very much.